Hello, this will be part 32 in the series An Ancient Legacy. I'm going to start wrapping it up, but with my favourite topic, numbers and the connections to ancient legends, but also to the flood legends. And so we'll be looking, comparing a few. So the Great Flood, it's a story crosses cultures, crosses time. You could speak quite long about that. But again, yeah, so most people will be familiar with Noah's flood, but there's the much older version, the the Epic of Gilgamesh describes the Great Flood. Also in the Hindu traditions, the story of the Manu and the Yugas, which began with a great flood, and there are a lot of connections between these, but they'll also connect to the two previous episodes, New Jerusalem, through measurements, through numbers, through this very important symbolism. Of course, countless cultures across the world have these stories of the flood, and as more and more evidence comes to light, especially recommend all the work of Randall Carlson, highly recommended. But yeah, it is at Asia, Europe, the Middle East, South America, Central America, Australia. It's barely a culture that doesn't have it, and there's a very unusual amount of synchronicity connections between these stories. But we'll begin with Sumer and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, this is tablet 11. This was written about 1500 BC. There are older versions of it, but this particular one is the most intact. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that will be a focus because it's the story of a flood. Gilgamesh goes to visit his ancestor Utnapishtim, who tells him the story of the flood and how Utnapishtim receives a warning ahead of time, that, very similar to the story of Noah's flood. He receives a warning and he builds an ark, which is referred to as the preserver of life. In tablet 11, it's also because it describes the dimensions, and essentially it's describing a cube. Now, I could describe a round boat. Again, not exactly sure, but the dimensions are given, and it's 120 cubits high, wide, and deep. And, well, again, this connection to these stories of cubes, which are connected to a very important measurement, I think is the more important version. But again, there are a lot of similarities with Noah's flood. Now, the flood described in the Bible is basically a long rectangle. It's not a cube, and I'm unsure myself with the cubit that they describe in the story of Noah's flood. There are a few different cubits, and I wouldn't be sure about them. Depending on which one you choose, you get some lovely connections, but still unsure, so I don't want to cherry pick favourite measures or try and stick with what has some benefit to it. But there are the similarities between Noah's flood and the Epic of Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh visits his ancestor at Utnapishtim, who tells him the story of the flood as it happened. So Gilgamesh is getting the story afterwards, as where Noah, if Methuselah. So it's a bit same sort of thing where he's going to see his ancestor, but just in sort of reverse order. But both of them, Utnapishtim and Noah, are warned of an impending flood, and they're told to build an ark or the preserver of life. Now, Gilgamesh brings every animal thing that he can gather onto the preserver of life, as where the story in Noah, two of every animal. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it rains for 7 days. 6 heavy days, lightens on the 7th. In the biblical version, Noah's story, it's 40 days and 40 nights. Now, it's interesting. The Israelites wandered 40 years in the desert, in the wilderness. Jesus, 40 days in the wilderness. King David ruled for 40 years. This is a common number, but that's something else. The ark settles on the mountain. The Noah's Ark settles on the mountain, and at the end to know that the flood had truly come to an end, Utnapishtim releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven after 7 days. In the story of Noah's flood, he releases a dove and a raven, again after 7 days, and that this is one of the connections, the connections between them. Very interesting. Now, the raven is considered an unclean bird, a carrion bird. Even see in this picture, it would eat the floating corpses, as where the dove would only settle on clean ground, and eventually the dove returns with the olive branch in its mouth. That's why the importance of the olive branch we still see now, of course. Now, in itself, there are many other quite interesting connections that go through, well, symbolism, esoteric organizations and traditions, and most importantly, temple architecture as well as city planning. And for the focus on that, we will look at the Corvus, or the blackbird, and Columba, the dove. And I'll put a link in the description where it's a bit of extended version talking about the dove or Columba and flood legends. That will be in the description. But as, for instance, not just Freemasons, but this very important. Now, there's also the acacia, which is interesting to focus on, but the ark is a common theme, and you'll find that reoccurring quite a bit, but also in the Templars, for instance, where we see both the ark and the dove. And of course, this dove, whether it's in Christian, so many other symbols, just really passes on. But Corvus and Columba, well, they're also constellations, and it's interesting that Corvus, for instance, is next to Hydra, the water snake, and sextans, a symbol of navigation. Columba, the constellation, is also next to what was used to be Argo, but there are also multiple symbols around there, but of, well, time and navigation as well. And again, they could bring us back to especially, well, the ark of the preserver of life, as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and also the story of Noah. But in another, well, connection, and this goes to these four very important cities. Now, everyone, probably knows about the sacred geometry symbolism in Washington. Even not in detail, they've heard that it's there, and even the most hardcore skeptics find it very hard, or impossible to deny it. However, Brasilia in Brazil, Astana, Kazakhstan, and Canberra in Australia are four cities that reflect exactly the same as Washington, not just in their design, not just in their temple plan, the use of very important symbolism and numbers, but even literally down to their legal status. So, for instance, Washington is a political capital in the District of Columbia. It's not in a state, and it's separated from the financial capital, New York. Astana is the same thing. It's in a separate province, separate legal structure, separated from the financial capital. Brasilia is in what's literally called the Federal District, just like the District of Columbia, separated from Sao Paulo, the financial capital. Canberra is in the ACT, Australian Capital Territory. It's not a state, once again. It has this special, the legal structure, everything about it, the town plans, the connections. It's, again, these four cities, very, very important. But they themselves have very, well, for instance, the District of Columbia. Now, you'll probably hear it's got to do with Columbus. Well, I would say, well, what Columbus never set foot on Columbia. He never set foot on North America. There is again, after the Columbians is one of these factions, a very ancient not ancient faction, but goes back at least well, quite some time, and that one is a bit of a hot potato. But the Columbians are one of the four. But the Columbian broadcasting system, Columbia Heights, of course, the nation of Columbia, it is Christopher Columbus, but that was not his original name. Where did he get the name Columbus? Where did he get the maps to find there's a whole other story there, but that's the District of Columbia now on its own. Okay, maybe. But we find it again in Canberra. Now, it's no secret that Walter Burley Griffin put symbols in the street plan, and so on next to Parliament House here, which was designed later by Romualdo Giurgola. Well, he repeated this pattern, and what we see throughout, there's a whole, again, it's in the literature that Walter Burley Griffin design included flora and fauna in that. I'm not, not seeing things that aren't there. It's as recorded. Even this is there's something right there, but that's basically a smaller version of the top view of Parliament House itself. So if you were to look above Parliament House, that's what you would see there. They have a double connection there, and this is actually indicating a scarab. But that's a long video, and because Canberra is a giant constellation star chart. But what we see in the tennis courts and this park here over the side, we see Columba and the blackbird. Again, it's not it's openly part of the original plan, and it was continued later with the new Parliament House. So we have Corvus and Columba there. But it's still repeated now, and so in new pieces of sculpture such as at Questacon and at New Acton, not just some random place, but these are also important in their locations, their positions, and we see again Columba and Corvus. Now, Brasilia, you see the same thing, and it's interesting to, okay, so behind the National Congress building, we have the Pantheon building, and we have Columba there. Now, this big closed peg thing is actually a pigeon house, and that's the location there. So we have a reference now. It's because it's mainly in Portuguese. I can't. It's hard to research Brasilia, but I guarantee you. Well, not guarantee you. I'll bet you there is blackbird, raven, Corvus symbolism elsewhere in Brasilia. But in Astana, we see the same thing: a pyramid of peace and reconciliation, which basically occupies the same position. So behind the main Congress building, the main center of power, we have Columbian symbolism in this a temple, essentially, the Pantheon there. And we have the same thing in the Pyramid of Peace and Reconciliation in Astana. It's literally in the same location, and the glass itself is embedded with this Columbian symbolism. But there are also other connections. So the Yugas and the Hindu, like Manu, the cycle of the Yugas began with a great flood, Vishnu, Manu. Well, there are a lot of, again, these similarities to the Sumerian story as well. Now, to begin with, for instance, the cube, the preserver of life, 120 by 120, 120 cubits. So the most you'll ever see is 3 sides, and that will give you 43,200 square cubits. Now, the whole cycle of the Yugas is 4,320,000 years. But the story so in the Manu story, there were 7 days of rain. He got a 7-day warning. There were 7 levels, like the deck. So there were 6 decks. The top deck would give us 7 levels on the Ark of Utnapishtim, and there were 7 sages in the flood there. Now, on the 7th day, he released the dove. Both of them carried 7 vessels, or 7 vessels of seed, made 7 sacrifices at the end, sacrificing for thanks after the flood had gone away. The Kali Yuga itself, 432,000 years. New Jerusalem, the last 2 episodes went into that. Again, it's 12,000 stadia, high, wide, and deep, instead of 120 cubits. So all the numbers are just repeated the same in the New Jerusalem. But so the total surface area would be 86,400 square cubits, so all that 86,400 seconds per day. And that's an interesting one to connect, because 864,000 years in the Vapara Yuga. And of course, that would also bring us to New Jerusalem by definition. But the edge length of New Jerusalem, 864 Royal Babylonian cubits. Did I write cubits? I should. Okay, that's grains, not cubits, but that's developed off this cubit, the Royal Babylonian Sumerian cubit, as in the Ark of Utnapishtim, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a Babylonian Sumerian legend, so they're using. That's why those measures are important. But it's also worth noting that the Great Pyramid itself is scaled to the size of a whole Earth at 86,400, if you look at it as a 3-dimensional object, rather than 2D multiple views and then timesing it to only get half a description of the Earth. Use 86,400, which also ties into the pendulum and to the Egyptian royal cubit itself. So the number is 86,400, not 43,200. And that, so again, we have a nice connection there. But it's also worth noting the volume of the Ark of Utnapishtim, preserver of life, same number as the Satya Yuga, and of course it's also reflected in New Jerusalem, very important, 12 cubed essentially. And so the Great Flood legends, stories, they have some, not just small connections and synchronicities. It's actually quite extensive, and it's, I think, again, that we see this tradition is being passed on and hidden in plain sight, as they say. It's not just written in the constellation into the city plan of major public buildings, major public cities, major city plan with this very esoteric occult connections, but it's also written into the numbers and the ancient structures and the ancient legends and the ancient stories.